the gut is very valuable. In addition to the brain, those are the two areas of your body that you use most as a judge. And if it didn't pass the gut test, I kind of knew something was wrong. My name is Harriet Farber Klein. I'm a retired Superior Court judge from the state of New Jersey, where I served for about 17 years. So there was a prosecutor in my court. We were about to start a 3-defendant homicide, believe it or not, and he had a directive not to start the case. And I was determined to start the case. We went out in the courtroom and I told him, we're picking a jury. Whereupon he had this like deer in the headlights look in his eyes, turns around, darts out of the courtroom like a sprinter, and I don't know what to do. And I yelled, "Seize that man!" The defendants were in, agape, like their mouths open. The prosecutor had just fled. My officers had heard what I said, but they're not about to leave the side of 3 homicide defendants. So the prosecutor made it down the stairs and hunkered down in his office. And because he was facing a contempt citation, his bosses had to come up and negotiate with me in chambers and get him relieved from that burden. But it made me a legend around the courthouse, for better or worse. I think it's bad. I think it's bad for the impression it gives of the judiciary. I really believe that you should not make people feel that they have to put on boxing gloves to come into the courtroom. And I think it's affected people's attitudes. They come in with a chip on their shoulder. They think the judge is going to diss them, going to give them a hard time. And little kids think that's what judges do. I go to schools and I give programs for Law Day, and a 6-year-old child never fails will raise their hand and say, "Are you like Judge Judy?" The panic button is something that every judge has on his or her desk, or under the desk, as it were. If a defendant does something a little bit crazy, if someone gets sick, if there's a heart attack, it could be any emergency that you can think of, you push that panic button. There was a situation where I was just a judge for about 6 months. I had a simple drug case in front of me. So it carried a mandatory sentence that meant the person's going to prison. And the defendant heard the juror render the verdict guilty, and he knew what was going to be coming after that, and he didn't want to have any of it. So he kind of jumped up and sort of almost like flipped the counsel table and started trying to escape. And I sat there kind of transfixed. So luckily, the officers were able to wrestle him onto the floor, which was like happening like right in front of my bench, and they pepper sprayed him in my courtroom. And I did, of course, hit the panic button then, and a lot of officers responded. So things like that happen. The phenomenon of jurors falling asleep in the courtroom is not as rare as you might think. It's not good for a juror to be asleep. You can't just leave him that way because he's missing out on the evidence, and that's what he's got to base a decision on, right? And I certainly don't want that to be a miscarriage of justice. And I also didn't want to embarrass the person. I didn't want to call him out and say, "Yoo-hoo." So I devised this idea that I would take one of my big, heavy rule books, and I knocked it off onto the floor. And it made an incredible noise, a tremendous noise, because you have this kind of cavernous courtroom. Oh my gosh, it would wake the dead. And, I would say, "Oh my gosh, how did I do that? I'm so clumsy." But it worked. You just can't do it twice in the same case. The desirable answer would be it's never appropriate. I mean, they say that a good judge should not have to use his or her gavel. It means that your courtroom is out of control. And, of course, I did have to use it sometimes if, the lawyers were starting to maybe get at it with each other. When I sat in criminal, I really felt that sentencing was the most awesome part of the job, because that's really where you're affecting people's lives and what their future is going to be. I don't know if people are aware how many offenses have as their root cause drug abuse. I recall there was an individual for whom that was so. He didn't have a bad record otherwise, but it was clear He was enmeshed with drugs, and that's what ran him afoul of the law. But I gave him probation with, as one of the conditions, drug treatment. So I guess it was about a year later, and I had already left the criminal bench, and I was in civil. And I was told that one of my former defendants was out in the courtroom and wanted to see me. So I couldn't figure what that's about. So I went out there with an officer, and this one individual came back to tell me how thankful he was. He was clean, he had a family, he had a job. And let me tell you, that was one of the greatest moments as a judge. I don't know how many others are out there like that. Maybe he's the only one. But the fact that I helped one person get on the straight and narrow, that is so terrific.